Namaste, good evening from India, and good morning to the people who are joining us from New York City, USA. On behalf of IMPRI Impact and Policy Research Institute and WestLand Books, Prabha एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान नई दिल्ली, I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, welcome you to IMPRI Web Policy Talk. Today, we are here for a special lecture and discussion on gender dimensions and impacts of suicide bereavement, exploring lived experiences by Dr. Nandini Murli. I would now like to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is Director at IMPRI. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Ritika, and I welcome all of you to this very special book discussion, and also lecture by Dr. Nandini Murli ma'am, who has also come out with a very recent book, Left Behind: Surviving Suicide Loss by WestLand publisher. And we are so fortunate to have with us our chair for today's deliberation, Professor Prabha Chandra, and also discussant, Dr. Carla Fine, joining us from New York City, USA. So without any further ado, let me introduce the chair for today's deliberation, Professor Prabha Chandra ma'am, who is the professor and head of Psychiatry department at National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, also known as NIMHANS, at Bangalore, India. She is president-elect of the International Association for Women's Mental Health and has been a visiting professor at the University of Liverpool, United Kingdom, UK. She is a clinical and an academic, and her research spans from gender issues in mental health to perinatal mental health and early childhood. Dr. Prabha is an editor and author of several books on the topic and has been featured as a champion for women's mental health in India by the Lancet Journal. NIMHANS is also our premier institution for this mental health issues also. And Prabha ma'am's, if anyone want to see ma'am's work, is also there in Google Scholar and other. And I would say ma'am is our country is one of the top intellectual in terms of citation and others also. And we for today's special lecture, we have Dr. Nandini Murli ma'am, who is joining us from Madurai. Ma'am is a person with diverse professional interests and engagements. She's an author, columnist, independent researcher in Indic studies, certified life coach, mental health promotion and suicide prevention activist, and a communication and gender and diversity professional. She has done various work with LGBTQ communities, mental health, resilience, development issues. Prior to also working on these issues, ma'am has also worked a lot in journalism. So I have also touched the issues of environment, gender issues, development paradigms, so many issues. And I'm sure today ma'am will talk much more on her book, which has recently come. We are also so fortunate to have as a discussant for today's deliberation, Dr. Carla Fine ma'am, who is an author, lecturer, and a workshop leader. And I would say ma'am's work on this issue has been very famous in USA, and all of us are very thankful. Thank you, ma'am. Carla Fine ma'am is the author of internationally best-selling book, No Time to Say Goodbye, Surviving the Suicide of a Loved One, now also available on audio, narrated by ma'am herself. The book is currently in its 24th printing and is also available in various languages like Japanese, Korean, and Portuguese. The book is a personal story of ma'am's husband, a prominent New York physician who killed himself in 1989 at the age of 43. And ma'am has then worked a lot on these issues, and one can find a lot of material on the same on ma'am's website, which is carlafine.com, CARLAFINE.com. So without any further ado, let me welcome the chair for today's deliberation, Professor Prabha Chandra ma'am, to give her opening and welcome remarks, and also to invite our speaker, Dr. Nandini ma'am, to give her lecture. Prabha ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arjun, and I'm very thankful to IMPRI for inviting me for this very important panel and talk that we are going to listen to. It's interesting that, Nandini comes from the city, Madurai, reigning goddess Meenakshi, and we have three women here who are going to be talking about gender issues, and I think it's such an important discussion. To sort of give a background, the gendered nature of the experience of being impacted by suicide, I think is something which has not been explored adequately. We all know that, across the world, men die by suicide much more than women, which means that the people who are left behind are often women. And you will listen to Nandini and Carla later about how the whole, the whole society and the community, including the mental health fraternity, is not completely aware of the impact that a suicide can have on the people who are left behind, and particularly the women, and what are the kinds of resources that they have to look within, and to get all the strength to kind of manage the whole situation when an event like this happens. We're going to listen to Nandini talk about her journey, and then we'll have Carla, responding to some of that and looking at parallels across the world, because there is probably more universality in the whole experience. And then we will definitely have some time for question and answers. And I'm so delighted that there are so many of you out there who probably been impacted by suicide in one way or the other, who have tuned in and might have lots of questions. I'm going to start with reading out from a book, which is one of my favorites. And this is, I'm quoting Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who we know wrote a lot about death and dying. And this is one of her final books. And she says, in order to be at peace, it is necessary to feel a sense of history, that you're both part of what has come before and part of what is yet to come. Being thus surrounded, you're not alone, and the sense of urgency that pervades the present is put in perspective. So I think these words kind of exemplify how the history, the journey, and the present has a continuity. And this continuity and narrating this continuity, sharing the journey with others becomes so important. So I do not want to come in between you and the speaker for today, Dr. Nandini Murli, who's going to talk about her book. And then I will also talk a little bit about what her book meant to me, and how it resonated with the work I do and how we can take this forward. So Nandini, over to you.
Good morning, good evening, namaste. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Arjun, for the introduction. Thank you, Professor Prabha Chandra, for setting the stage. And thank you, Carla Fine, for being my inspiration and for being present today. I also see several people I know in the present today, people who've been part of my journey in one way or the other. And I thank you for your presence. My presentation today is based on my book, Left Behind, Surviving Suicide Loss, which is published by WestLand Publishers and which will be released this week. The presentation today will consist of 3 parts. In the first part, we'd be looking at what is suicide bereavement and how it is different from other kinds of bereavement. In the second part, we'd be looking at impacts of suicide bereavement. How does it impact those who've lost a loved one to suicide? And in the third part, we'll be looking at the gender dimensions of this issue. All 3 parts are interrelated and interconnected, and we'll be viewing them through the lens of lived experience narratives. Why do we tell our stories? It is said that the universe is made of stories, not atoms. Our personal lives are connected to larger issues. Through the telling of our narratives, our stories, we weave the tapestry of our lives with the warp and weft of our life experiences. When we live our stories, have the power and agency to tell our narratives the way we want to, we are being true to ourselves. However, stories need a sacred space in which to be told and heard. Truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction. So today, I invite you to listen to an unheard voice, an untold story, because truth can indeed set us free. April 27th, 2017. For most people, this day may not. However, for me, that was the day my life changed forever. That was the day I lost my husband, Dr. T.R. Murali, a well-known urologist, to suicide. That was the day when one death by suicide killed two. That was the day I lost my precious partner and the sun plunged into darkness. Space dissolved. Time stood still. My life changed forever. The axis of my life heaved, cracked, and split. In the wake of that devastation, my life changed forever. One chapter in my life, that of a spouse, was over. Yet I wondered if the past would hold me hostage, or whether I could use the past as a springboard to rebuild my future. Why had this happened at all? That day, I had no answers, only questions. With Murli's death by suicide, I had gained membership into an exclusive club. I had acquired status as a freshly minted survivor of suicide loss. My membership in this exclusive club was entirely by chance, not by choice. Suicide is not spoken about easily or openly today across all societies. There is a wall of shame, secrecy, and silence surrounding it. People like me are individuals with a lived experience of suicide loss. This simply means we've had a direct first-hand experience of having lost a loved one to suicide. We are experts by experience, and that is just as valuable as any of the other kinds of credentials, including academic credentials people earn. How was I to navigate the wilderness of suicide grief when my internal GPS had crashed? I felt like a cork tossed around in a turbulent ocean of grief and sorrow. As a survivor of suicide loss, I surveyed the wreckage of my life, stooped to pick up fragments in the debris, yearned for a glimpse of stability. But the harsh reality was that I would never be able to reclaim the old normal again. In the rubble of a sense of stability. However, for me, the old, the familiar, the known had all been blown to smithereens. According to the WHO, close to 1 million people die of suicide every year. Every 40 seconds, someone in the world dies of suicide. Every 41 seconds, someone is left to make sense of this loss. Millions of families, millions of people like me. However, for us, those who have lost a loved one to suicide, people who die by suicide are not nameless, numberless, faceless statistics. A suicide is often a sudden, violent, unanticipated, and entirely shocking death. This self-inflicted death violates every fundamental norm of self-preservation. Why then do some of our loved ones choose to kill themselves? Truly, it has been described as a death like no other. Until it happened to me, I naively believed that suicide could not happen in my family. It could happen only to others in other families. My only brush with suicide were news reports in the media and the suicide in a friend's family when I was in school. Even then, as a young girl, it had struck me that my friend's family had refused to discuss the suicide. It was cloaked in an iron curtain person of secrecy, shame, and silence. Ironically, here I was confronting the suicide of my spouse in my home, and I too was overcome with the same sense of shame and acute embarrassment. What would I tell the family, my friends, my colleagues? Would they judge my husband? Would they brand him as a coward, as irresponsible, someone who could not face life? After all, he had been a very responsible and a very brilliant doctor. Or would they judge me as having failed in my wifely responsibilities? The fear of judgment hung over me like a pall of shame. And to make matters worse, when the tragedy happened, I was away traveling on work. So what would I tell others? Initially, I began to evolve a strategy. I thought I would have an official version of the death, which I would attribute to socially acceptable reasons as illness, maybe he died in sleep, or perhaps he met with an accident, anything that was socially acceptable, anything which would not turn the spotlight of blame and judgment. Tale of very turbulent emotions, very toxic, shame, anger, fear, self-reproach, blame, uh, and of all the emotions, fear felt very disconcerting. The grief felt very primal, it felt very feral, it felt very raw. And later, I loved this one line by C.S. Lewis. He said, I quote, "Nobody ever told me that grief felt so much like fear," unquote. However, my experience of suicide is vulnerability. Suicide is a very public act, but the grief is very private. As a survivor of suicide loss, I was confronted with multiple challenges. Insensitivity. Intrapend was a very well-known person spotlight for the wrong reasons. All this compounds our primary loss and makes our grief extremely difficult. I really wondered then, and perhaps I do even now, had Murli died due to socially acceptable reasons, would I have come under the moral scanner as I did? I discovered, to my dismay and horror, that there is considerable blaming and shaming of survivors of suicide loss. Families of those of survivors of suicide loss find ourselves at an increased risk of suicide. I'm told it's almost 400 times higher. I'd like to quote these lines by Jeffrey Jackson from his insightful handbook, book, which is called A Handbook for Survivors of Suicide. Jackson has been impacted by suicide loss. He had lost his wife to suicide, and he writes, I quote, "For the person you lost, the pain is over. Now it's time to start healing yours. You are a survivor of suicide, and as that unwelcome designation implies, your survival, your emotional survival, will depend on how well you learn to cope with the tragedy. The bad news, surviving this will be the second worst experience," unquote. The word bereaved literally means to be torn apart. When we lose our loved one to a suicide, our lives are ripped apart. Our lives are ripped apart, inside out, outside in. Everything turns topsy-turvy. Light becomes dark. Moments which a few minutes ago would have brought smiles to our faces now reduce us to tears. My life ruptured at the seams, and it seemed as if this hemorrhage would just continue unchecked. Every fatal suicide leaves at least 6 people bereaved. I felt my life was throttled, shaken at the very foundations by a very powerful earthquake, and all that was left in my life was debris and rubble and irreparable fault lines. Suicide grief is traumatic, to say the least. Someone once described it very evocatively as grief with its volume turned on, unquote. Murli's death was sudden, shocking, completely unanticipated. And as a survivor of suicide loss, I was just trying to turn off this volume and I was struggling to find the controls because I didn't know. I was groping for the controls, and the decibels of suicide grief was so overwhelming. I just wanted to shut it off, but I didn't know where the controls were. I was not only mourning the loss of a partner, but I was even more traumatized because it was I who had discovered the suicide. Suicide across societies, across the world, is not an easy topic to talk about. It is shrouded in stigma and shame, which festers silence and secrecy. Unfortunately, such negative stereotypes of suicide influence, impact, and inform the trajectory of suicide grief. This makes moving through the wilderness of suicide grief, as someone put it, a very lonely, frightening, profoundly isolating, and alienating experience for us survivors of suicide loss. Human beings are hardwired for connections. It is in our biology. Right from our birth, it's a vital force that shapes us physically, emotionally, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. Yet, when it comes to people and situations which do not fit society's definition of normal or normativity, such as suicide, we are hardwired to disconnect. A suicide is the only death where those who survive the loss are compelled to deny, hide, invisibilize, or invent socially acceptable reasons for the cause of the death. Because suicide is a social, cultural, and religious taboo, survivors of suicide loss are overcome by an overwhelming sense of shame and acute embarrassment. We therefore seek to reinvent the mode of death in a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of honor both for the deceased, ourselves, and our families. Most people who came to condole me were not interested in my grief. Instead, they were more interested in what happened, why did it happen, tell us why. I found them taking on the role of judge and jury and detectives. My sorrow, my pain did not matter. In fact, it was as if I did not exist. I was completely erased and invisibilized. And ironically, I found myself taking on the role of a detective. I found myself championing my husband, extolling his wonderful qualities, both professionally and personally. And in doing so, and I was trying to speak up, advocate for myself, saying that, oh, of course, I had been a very committed and responsible wife because I had been in this marriage for 33 odd years, had journeyed with him throughout his medical career, been with his highs and lows, stood by him like a rock, but yet this happened. So what am I supposed to do? And I found myself trying to absolve my both myself and the husband, my husband, for what had happened. And this was very confusing. Of course, I knew all this only in hindsight, but at that point it was extremely confusing and harrowing. And I found that there were very few heartfelt condolences. There was a palpable empathy and a compassion deficit. I was haunted by survivor guilt. Every survivor of suicide loss grapples with a fundamental question. What could I have done to anticipate and prevent this death? Why didn't I see it coming? I was driven by an inflated sense of responsibility. In fact, an exaggerated sense of responsibility for what happened. I found that I tended to own my husband's decision to end his life. I spent a lot of my time not in grieving, not in mourning, but actually in ruminating about why had this happened? What could have possibly driven him to end his life? What were those last moments? What were those agonizing moments? there was a lot of what ifs and what ifery, and I was just going around in circles. I was actually trying to comprehend the motivations of my husband for having ended his life. And one part of me was grieving. One part of me was grieving the loss of a partner, and at the other, and another part of me was trying to analyze what had happened. I felt compelled by an intense need to conduct a personal psychological autopsy, and I now realize today all this was part of my burning desire to make sense of what had happened, of this very mysterious and puzzling death. I felt it was like I was trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle, a giant jigsaw puzzle. I had most of the pieces, but the vital pieces were missing, and I was trying to complete the jigsaw puzzle without those pieces, trying hard to find those pieces. And ironically, today I realized I will never find those pieces. Perhaps I may never know the reason why it happened. And that's also okay, because that is part of my healing. This overwhelming need to know the truth, to get to the bottom of what happened, that is no longer there. But then that is part of the trajectory every suicide loss survivor goes through. Suicide shatters many things we take for granted about ourselves, our relationships, and the world. Our perceptions, one of the things that shatters is our perceptions of our loved one and the nature of our relationship with them. Our reality is negated. We do a harsh reality check. Did we know our loved one at all? Or were we living with a stranger? As a survivor of suicide loss, I confronted several recurring themes. I had an overwhelming desire to make meaning of this mysterious, puzzling death. I wanted to decipher the motivations of why my husband chose to kill himself. I relentlessly explored my role and responsibility for this tragic loss. At the same time, I was swamped by overwhelming emotions. The fear felt so fearful. It would be paroxysms of grief, and they would give me a brief respite. And I would find myself saying, "Oh my God, just don't throttle me again." I just felt I was ambushed by a ruthless apex predator. And all this was amplified and reinforced by mainstream narratives of suicide, which view it as a character flaw, as a moral flaw, as crime and sin, and not as a serious public health issue, which it really is. I'd like to add at this point, just 15 days after my tragedy, I stumbled upon Carla Fine's remarkable book, No Time to Say Goodbye. And today I don't know, I don't have the right word, that it's Carla who is, along with Professor Prabha Chandra, who is holding space for me at the other end. I could go on and on and on about Carla, whom I've talked in my book. But for now, love to quote these very meaningful lines from her brilliant book. I quote, "In my mourning, I too wanted to be like everyone else. I wanted my family and friends to comfort me, not to question me why Harry had killed himself. I wanted to grieve my husband's absence, not analyze the reasons for his dying. I wanted to celebrate his kindness and friendship throughout the 21 years of our marriage, not to rage at him for abandoning me at the prime of our lives." Unquote. I found myself, I was an object of voyeurism and speculation. It was like I was living my private grief in the fishbowl of public gaze, colored by the lens of judgment. Very soon, the police were swarms of police were at home, and my home, which is sacred to me, to us, resembled a crime scene, and they were all over. I was subject to insensitive probing, uh, intrusive questions, which I've detailed in my book. And all this was conducted in public gaze, and there were lots of inquisitive onlookers looking on at my distress. I say all this not to blame a system, but to highlight how all this exacerbates our primary loss, our primary trauma, and actually makes it unbearable. And I also felt this intrusive questioning, this probing, insensitive probing, was a violation of the rights to privacy and dignity, not only of me as a survivor of suicide loss, but also the dignity and privacy of the deceased. I felt very vulnerable, very fragile, very naked, uh, felt very raw. And very soon, I also began to internalize this sense of shame and guilt. It is then, I think, I'm sure it is for every survivor of suicide loss across the globe, we are shocked, we are actually horrified to realize that, oh, it's the standard procedure to treat every fatal suicide as a murder until it is proved otherwise. So, so I found myself being the prime suspect in this, and had to defend myself. So I found myself taking on the role of judge and jury, and they said, oh, this is all procedural formalities, and that is extremely harrowing for us because we have no idea of the intricacies of law enforcement, and this whole thing looks very intimidating and familiar. And by now it's like sometimes I feel all this is actually the primary trauma is nothing compared to all the secondary traumatization and victimization we are subject to, all in the name of procedural formalities. I also found it impossible to share my experience with others. I just felt we lacked a common language, syntax, grammar, and vocabulary with which to share my experiences. That's why I resonated so much with Carla's experience and Carla's book. And I think over the next few months, it was the beginning of a very beautiful friendship. I would say a very beautiful sisterhood. And Carla's book and Carla's perspectives actually set me on a path, on a very empowering path through this wilderness of suicide grief. I was determined not to play the victim card at all. Suicide is a very difficult conundrum. It's the typical catch-22 situation. Why do our loved ones kill themselves? Do they do it voluntarily? Is it a matter of choice? And I also found that while I was mourning the loss of a partner, I just felt very angry with him, for just abandoning me. I remember bellowing during the funeral, even my love was not enough for you. What didn't I do for you? It just felt a complete betrayal and abandonment at that point. But I think that's the trajectory of this extremely difficult path through this wilderness of suicide grief. And then what I discovered, there was more to follow. It was one shock after the other. I just found that as a survivor of suicide loss, every survivor like me goes through a complete disruption of social relationships, whether it's in the family or whether it's friends, whether it's with colleagues or with the larger society. We are very fearful and uncertain of how family and friends would respond to us, relate to us, because there is this implicit sense of blame. Even if they don't actually blame you, there is that, and I think so much of stigma and shame is actually nonverbal. It is that look on the face, it is that body language, it is that lift of the eyebrows. Oh, what sort of a wife have you been? And I found myself very pathetic, because here I was trying to tell people, oh, actually I've been so supportive, blah blah blah, and all I would get was a stony silence and a disbelief. And equally important, people were also very uncertain and ignorant about how to respond to me, and I entirely commiserate with their predicament as well. But ironically, it's this ambiguity and ambivalence which makes suicide bereavement so isolating and so bewildering. It causes information management systems, problems in information management systems in families. Most families agonize about how much do they reveal? Do they disclose the nature of the death, or do we whitewash it? To tell or not to tell becomes a very contentious issue that splits family. There is this whole issue of transparency. Most families prefer to keep it as a secret for various reasons. But this has a very powerful impact on healing, which I've talked about in my book. And as a survivor of suicide loss, me and many others like me, we struggle to create a shared narrative in the aftermath of the suicide. I remember, Carla, in one of our conversations, I remember you telling me, it's like when there is a suicide in the family, it's like as if a giant meteorite has crashed into the family, destroyed the family, and the family shatters, splinters into a million fragments, and each of them orbits in their own path. And it causes estrangement in the family. It causes breakup of relationships which we previously took for granted, just disappear overnight, almost in a fraction of a second. And actually, all this really makes our bereavement very challenging, because we are deprived of those supports, those pillars of stability when we most need it. Everything is just pulled out, and we're almost like at the edge of the abyss, plunge into a bottomless abyss, and you don't know, it's a free fall. And this actually complicates our primary trauma, and it deprives us of that valuable support in our transition journey. And I cannot tell you how much our journey, our transition would have been easier if we had had all those supports still working for us, if all those people for whom we had given our lives, for whom we had put our lives on hold, had been there for us when we most needed them. Suicide bereavement is, as we can see, extremely complex and complicated, very challenging, and we are confronted with very distinct bereavement issues. I get very annoyed and sometimes also very rightfully angry when people say that, oh, it is just like any other kind of bereavement. I wish it were, but honestly, it's not. We have distinct bereavement issues. For one is that suicide is a taboo. So we find it very difficult to talk openly about how our loved ones die. Trust me, it takes a lot of courage for us to say, oh, our loved one killed himself or herself. We find it very difficult to acknowledge the mode of death, the cause of death. We find it very difficult to ask for social support. And I must mention, even mental health professionals are at a loss how to really deal with our issues, our needs and concerns. We don't need a one size fits all. We need something which uniquely honors our needs and experiences. And we can't publicly mourn the death. We are so ashamed of the mode of death, the way they died. And this is exactly what this disenfranchised grief is all about. Disenfranchised, simple, it just means we have no right to grieve. It's as if our right to grieve has been rudely taken away from us, and therefore we go into the closet like cockroaches, hidden there for God knows ages, and our grief festers inside. And this makes it, and we find it very difficult to integrate the loss, and we are little islands by ourselves, and we struggle to frame a coherent narrative of the loss. And what do we really want? We want people to normalize our grieving. We want people to validate our loss unconditionally, and we want people to know that we no matter whether you are a spouse or a parent, and if the child or the partner kills himself or herself, we cannot own that decision, and we may never know why our loved ones choose to kill themselves. That is perhaps, we may never know. And ironically, we're being asked, why did this happen? Tell us why. And I remember during when people came to condole me, it was like I was recounting this endlessly every time someone came home. And I even thought maybe I should just do a recording and, say, play it. Okay, this is what happened. Because every time I was asked the same thing, it was very re-traumatizing at that point. And And then we go on, but of course our healing is when we learn to accept all this. That's, I'm not talking about that right now. And another very important aspect of disenfranchised grief is that we find it very difficult to retain happy memories of the loved one we lost through a suicide. I remember one parent who had lost her son to suicide. She told me, I don't even want to look at his photograph, because how could he do this to me? And people, when they talk to us also, they don't realize that we want to talk about the good times we shared with our loved ones, not always talk about this death, or not talk about the way they died. We want to remember our loved ones for the way they've lived their lives, not for the way they died. And we don't want to be branded as a parent or a spouse who lost a loved one to suicide. That's not a tag we want. So and we just, all this makes us feel very disconnected from our loved one's legacy, and we struggle with this. How do you, I would find people telling me, oh, think of the lovely times you had with him. But actually, that's the struggle. How do I think of the lovely times? When I think of the lovely times, I really wonder, oh my gosh, why had this happened? And to be able to think of the lovely times, I need people to also have that, create that space for a conversation when I could also remember Murli for the person he was and not for the way he died. And I'm sure every survivor of suicide loss goes through this. And our memories of our loved one are overwhelmingly colored by their mode of death. And we would need support. We would need a lot of, whatever you call it, to help us, separate this. I say all this because grieving is both an individual and a collective experience. We don't grieve in isolation. We need spaces, safe, supportive spaces, to enable people experiencing disenfranchised grief to embrace the grief, to help us rediscover meaning and purpose in our lives. I just like to go on to the gender dimensions of this loss. Gender, as we all know, is a psychosocial cultural construct based on societally mandated roles and expectations of how women, men, and people across the spectrum, people who identify themselves across the spectrum, describe themselves. Here, of course, I'm looking at gender as a spectrum and not as a binary construct. We all know there is so much of invisibilization, so much of muting of experiences of people who've been bereaved by suicide loss, and gender roles, gender identity, normative ideas of masculinity. What is a real man in today's context? Point to the influence of gender on suicide bereavement. From my talking to other people bereaved by suicide loss, I understand that there is considerable victim blaming and shaming, especially of wives who lose husbands to suicide. And I think Carla would attest to that. This is so across societies, across cultures. I guess the heteropatriarchal nature of the modern family, in this context, a woman, a wife, a daughter, is perceived as a custodian of culture and tradition and an upholder of the family honor. The suicide of a spouse, of a husband, or a father, I think causes people to question this role. So you haven't been a good wife, you haven't been a good parent. It's an indictment of our roles, of the failure as failure as women. And ironically, we women internalize this 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 view. I also find that parents who've lost children to suicide, the mother is blamed for not being a responsible parent, and it's heartrending to see what they are going through. And I also found in my interactions with young girls who've lost their father to suicide, they are being there is this victim blaming and shaming. In fact, one young girl told me, this lovely young woman, she told me that after her father's death, people attributed her father's suicide to quote unquote a love affair. And there was considerable shaming of the girl went through. Her mobility was restricted. And ironically, she has a male sibling, and none of these rules and regulations were applied to him after the father's death. And I think last week, Carla and I had another interesting conversation in which she said that a mother who dies of suicide is perceived as being irresponsible. And whereas if a father dies of suicide, it is attributed to several other very reasonable, quote unquote, reasonable causes. And I also find that in contrast, men who have lost, husbands who have lost their wives to suicide, I don't think they go through this kind of victim blaming and shaming. It's probably non-existent or very negligible. And ironically, what I found was that husbands who've lost their wives to suicide, actually they were commended on being very supportive spouses, especially if the wives were struggling with a mental health disorder condition. I think Professor Prabha Chandra could comment on this. It was this, oh, she was this mad woman, you know, the mad woman narrative. And look at this husband, he was so supportive, and he did whatever needed to be done. And ironically, when I was talking to some of the husbands who had lost their wives to suicide, even they themselves was commended themselves on being such wonderful spouses. And that's something, as I think many women like me would never be able to do that. You know, it was like, oh, we've done our best. And but then this had to happen. And we also find differences in coping styles of women, men, and other people across the spectrum in how they cope with suicide bereavement. Women, I found that they were more eager to access self-help groups and other interventions focused on self-disclosure and sharing of feelings. I think I found a very feminine, intuitive style of grieving, whereas men seemed more logical, rational, messy emotions. I don't want to handle with it. I also found that men tended to deal with their grief by immersing themselves in work, more work and more work, because it's considered so socially acceptable. A very masculine, very instrumental way of dealing with the grief, very stoic, very self-reliant. And these gendered dimensions of suicide loss, they have enormous implications in shaping public discourse and policy and professional engagement with survivors of suicide loss, which I think right now in the country is negligible or very non-existent. I just go to the last part of my presentation where I just want to focus a little more on shame, which is a very universal emotion. All of us at various points have experienced shame, and the experience of shame causes us to downsize ourselves, deny the reality of our experience, and makes us feel very, very small. And in the context of suicide bereavement, shame acquires very special dimensions and implications. As survivors of suicide loss, shame compels us to hide our truth. We are afraid people will reject us, judge us, isolate us, exclude us, blame us. We are we are fearful of being perceived unworthy of love. We are afraid that the suicide of our loved one will define our reality and circumscribe us. And however, speaking about shame, that's what I'm doing right now. That's what Left Behind is all about. Neutralizes the power to harm us. Not only do we need to tell our stories, we also need to create safe, supportive spaces for those conversations to happen. We need to create a sangha or a group which enables survivors of suicide loss to speak up truthfully about their loss and enable them to ask and receive support. As before I conclude, I must say, I wrote Left Behind because for many reasons. One of the main reasons I was very clear is that a survivor of suicide loss is not a badge of honor for me. My book is not a grand narrative of my. It's really not a badge of honor, and it's not a neither is a mindless the loss is a huge part of who I am today. However, it did not in any way define me, reduce me, or limit me in any way. As survivors of suicide loss, our voices are unheard and unseen, and concerns unrecognized. Only through telling our piece can we make ourselves heard, connect with others, receive and offer empathy. We need a Sangha, this community of support people, to create safe spaces to enable us to tell our stories. In doing so, we release our shame and embrace self-worth and forge ahead with courage, conviction, and compassion. Being honest, showing up, being real were important milestones in my journey through the wilderness of suicide grief. I'd like to believe this audacity of authenticity enabled me to challenge the status quo, to challenge, question dominant narratives of suicide loss in society. I'd like to conclude with this lovely quotation by Brené Brown, one of my favorite authors. She said, quote, "You have to be brave with your life so that others can be brave with theirs," unquote. How many suicides does it take before we realize that preventing suicide is everybody's business? And perhaps that's how we drive change. That's how we make ourselves seen and heard. That's how we tell people, tell the world that monumental sorrows can be left behind, one story at a time. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yes, Prabha ma'am,
Thank
over
you.
to you. I was just going to ask that those who want to ask any question, kindly post there in the Q&A or in the chat box. Prabha ma'am, over to you. Yes.
Thank you, Nandini. Thank you for, that um, that journey that you took us through. Thank you for talking to us about how you felt. Thank you for your story, and thank you for taking the challenge of and being courageous enough to move out of the fishbowl that you mentioned and getting out into the sea, and also trying to change the narrative around suicide. I think today is a very, very important day where we are talking about things that we seldom talk about, and by people who seldom talk about it. So um, I think all that you have done is going to make a difference, and I hope this is the beginning of a movement. I would at this stage like to invite Dr. Carla Fine to come in, and she's somebody who's had a universal experience of uh, being impacted by suicide. She's also been quite close to Nandini and has helped her through her journey, has been a fellow walker along the path. So Dr. Carla, we would love to listen to you and to what you have to share with us.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate being here today. My only regret is I'm not sitting next to Nandini like I was in person a year ago when I visited her in her house in India. I'm coming to you from New York City, and although Nandini and I are so far away from each other, we're really close. We consider ourselves sisters, and we are bound together, not just by grief, but by knowledge and by trying to rid the shame that surrounds the suicide of a loved one. I will just very briefly tell you my story, which is very similar. I was married. My husband was a prominent urologist here in New York City, and we were married for 21 years, and he killed himself at the age of 43. We had been married for 21 years. At that point, I knew nothing about suicide. I had no clue, except what kind of, if there were celebrities. And like Nandini, I could not believe that my husband, who was a healer, a wonderful doctor, who was, as I said, kinder to others than he was to himself, killed himself and took his life, and also similar took part of mine. Harry killed himself by injecting himself with an anesthetic, thiopental. I found him on his examining table in his office, still hooked up to the IV. When I looked at him there, my life changed from there's a before and an after to suicide. And at that moment, my life became an after. I had very similar experience with the police, with the shame, with the families, with all of the, it didn't feel like a regular death. And over the years, through my journey, I know that suicide and death are two separate phenomena. Those of us who've lost loved ones to suicide first, we have to go through the suicide and then we have to go through the death. And the first year or two, everything is about the suicide, 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 suicide. Why'd he do it? Why'd she do it? What did I do? And it's very even hard to even kind of comprehend that you've lost somebody, that the person has died. And then when all of that starts coming together, you realize, wait a minute, I'm a widow, or I lost my child, or I lost my mother. And you realize that you have to start mourning in a different kind of a way. And there is one thing I have found since I wrote my book, No Time to Say Goodbye, Surviving the Suicide of a Loved One. And I traveled, I guess, throughout the United States and throughout the world, talking to groups of survivors of suicide loss and also professional groups. What I have realized is that the shame and stigma and taboo of suicide crosses all religious, cultural, national grounds. If there's something that is similar in every religion and culture and country, it is the idea that there is some kind of shame in suicide. And that's why Nandini talking about it so openly, and we talk about it openly, because there are so many of us. I really have never really met anyone who hasn't had some kind of experience with suicide. And we just don't talk about it because of the shame of that. And it just took me many years to just accept the fact that Harry had made a decision that I had disagreed with. And he didn't ask me my opinion, because I would have told him not to do it. And the questions of the why, the what if, they haunt us. What if I had done this? Why did he do this? What if I had done this? And the whys and what ifs can drive us crazy because we don't know the answers. And I wonder sometimes, if Harry was here and I said, why did you do it? And he would say, I don't know why I did it. And it's a very brave and courageous act, what Nandini is doing and coming out and talking about it. And the more of us that come out and talk about what it is and what it's like, and I can tell you, for me, it's helped my journey. And when Nandini emailed me after reading my book, and we were so far away from each other geographically, and yet we were immediate sisters, and we knew exactly what we were going through. And I had the honor to meet Nandini in person when she came to New York for a conference. And then just coincidentally, the last trip that I made before COVID was to South India. And I was able to visit Nandini in her home and have dinner with her in her home. And it was really amazing that we were so far away and yet we were so together. And I just want to say that her book is amazing. It made me cry. It made me re-examine what I was going through. It opened up new doors of thinking for me, and it's helpful and it's healing. And when she asked me to be part of this, I was like, oh, of course, and thank you so much. Thank you. And we mourn our loved ones. We honor their lives, And as Nandini mentioned, we try to remember for how they lived and not how they died. So I will answer, along with Nandini, any questions there might be. And I thank you so much again for including me so far away, but so close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla, for talking to us about your journey. And like you mentioned, there are so many similarities in these journeys, even if there are differences, and even if you're different cultures, different religions, different parts of the world, but there's so much universality. And like Nandini mentioned, there is universality there, yet there is uniqueness in each
Yes.
person's life. And I think as a mental health professional today, you have been my teachers, because I think that we need to listen to more people who've been impacted by suicide and to understand what it really means. I think as mental health professionals, I'm humbled because I don't think we give enough attention to what happens. Um, Even if, let's say, you have a patient who died by suicide, there is often an examination of what you might have not done or done wrong, or kind of trying to protect yourself in some ways. But do we really pay enough attention to all the family members, to the child, to the mother, to the husband, to the wife who's been impacted by suicide? Is something that I'm beginning to examine as I read Nandini's book. And like you mentioned, I think the first few pages of Nandini's book, I told her I just teared up. I just kept tearing up. But at the same time, as I went through the book, I realized that it was almost like a celebration of her journey, of her trying to find meaning in what had happened, of trying to unravel the difficult tapestry of all the emotions, the experience of raging out and of being angry against the system, which doesn't recognize what somebody needs at that point. So I think there is a whole range of emotions there. And then the second part of the book, which actually again looks at the universality of experience, which explores other people's experiences, and that is such a brave thing, because sometimes grief can make you internalize it so much that you are not able to recognize other people's emotions. So the fact that Nandini reached out to so many others who'd gone through similar experiences and tried to understand how their narrative was similar or different than hers, to make a coherent meaning of this whole experience, I think is something that I, as a mental health professional, believe me not, it is something that the first time that I'm actually acknowledging and understanding. And I need to understand a bit much more than what I have. And like I said, I think you are all going to be our teachers, and to open our eyes to something which we have probably not acknowledged. There are quite a few questions which have come up, and I would like to sort of address these questions, because I think these are very important questions. Just to let you know, and those who are listening to us, is that this is a very important point for India. We are actually formulating a national suicide prevention policy and strategy. And I think Nandini's book comes at a very important time, where we can actually talk to our policymakers about enough support, sensitive support for people impacted by suicide. So I think it's a very important thing that we need to talk about at this juncture, because as we all know, India contributes to the maximum number of suicides in the world. And suicide is one of the most important causes of death in people between the ages of 15 and 39 years of age. So I think it's something that can't be ignored any longer, can't be kept on the back burner. It's something that we need to address. So if you're okay with it, I'm going to ask some of the questions that have come up. I'm going to start right from the beginning. Some of the people have been anonymous, some have named themselves. And the first question is about why does there seem to be a dearth of support groups in India? in a country where there's such severe shortage of mental health professionals and problems of stigma, affordability, and suicide helplines are not, often available. Why is it that the concept of support groups does not seem to find prevalence? Is there an alternative um, for suicide, bereavement, and bereavement in general? And should we look for such solutions in community and society rather than only looking at professionals and policy? So basically, the role of the support groups and the kind of work Nandini and Carla you're doing to make sure that support groups happen. I would like both of you to respond to this.
Can I go first,
Yes, please, Nandini.
Prabha?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It is a very interesting question and something I've also been trying to figure out. I found that when I was going through my bereavement, I didn't find any support group in India for survivors of suicide loss, either online or offline. And in fact, I found two online support groups. They were both run by people from the US, and I was the only person from India, a member there. And I'm still a member in those groups because even though it's now 4 years since uh, since the tragedy, I find that I do need support, and I think it's something so liberating and healing to be able to talk with people who've had a similar experience of suicide loss. I just feel it normalizes the whole experience. It validates us, and I think this whole thing, our grief becomes uh, re-enfranchised, I would say. And it's so liberate. I mean, it's actually very healing. And I did try to start one in Madurai, and I had a few people accessing the group, but after some time, after 2-3 sessions, I don't know what happened. um, I also know that membership in a bereavement group is not static. People come and go, and I think when they most need it, they're there, and when they're uh, but another thing I found is that when I was trying to tell people that there is a support group here, so why don't you access? So what they told me was, the families say, why do you want to go there and tell your stories? You might as well just keep it to yourself. So it's like the family feels this is not to be talked about, so they actually dissuade people from seeking support. Um, uh, and yeah, so this has been my experience, but I really don't know how does one break that barrier. uh, because I think membership in a suicide bereavement group is actually very, very, very healing. Yeah. Simply because you swap stories and you listen to the other person's story, and then you realize, oh, you're not alone. And especially when you see people who've dealt with that bereavement in a very empowering way. I think, like, for instance, Carla, when I read her book and when I started talking to her, that was a way forward for me. Because I didn't want to be talking to people who really were not facing that. But it is a challenge setting up bereavement groups in India. Maybe Professor Prabha Chandra, you could throw some light on how do we, that bottleneck, I don't know how to address it. Maybe if more people like me start talking about it, and, maybe the book is out, and I don't know. I'm curious. From Carla's book, I understand that support groups, post-pension services are very comprehensive in the US, and support groups, lots of people access support groups. I'm wondering when we can reach that stage here. I guess we are light years away. We haven't even started. So
And I'd like to add that support groups saved me. I was going to a psychologist, but I also at the same time was going to a support group. And I really feel that those support groups saved my life because as Nandini mentioned, there are many of them, and they were in person. And I went to maybe around 3 a month, different ones. There were different people every week. Sometimes you'd see the same people. but we all shared that same experience. And whether there were 3 people in the room or 10 people in the room, it was really important that we could say is what we called the S word, the suicide word. And we talked about it, and whether it didn't, I thought it would matter who we lost, that it had to be people that lost their husbands. It didn't matter. It mattered what the experience was. And I think one of the most important things that I got out of support groups is that nobody judged anyone. The only people we judged were ourselves. We judged ourselves. And then the more we realized that we didn't judge anyone else, then why should we judge ourselves? And that was a really big insight for me, because of course I didn't judge anyone there. Then why should I then judge myself? Now I am visiting some support groups as a guest speaker, you could say, and they're all on Zoom right now. And it's a different experience than in person. The only good thing is that it's you get people, at least in the US, from different parts of the country, and different, it's more, you may get different kinds of experiences, maybe religious, cultural experience, because it's not just New York City centric. We do a lot, part of the in-person support groups is almost after the meeting, when you're sitting around having coffee and cake, and then saying, well, you know, having that experience and that connection. So whether it's online or in person, it's the connection, the actual connection, to know that there are others out there that you can talk without shame, without judgment, and get right to the point. They know exactly what they're talking about because they're there with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla and Nandini. And I think, Nandini, you're right that, like Carla mentioned, there are so many support groups available in the US, and for every condition, every situation. The whole culture of support groups in India is very, it's still in the very early stages, because a lot of the whole sort of premise is that the family handles everything. That you should not actually, like you mentioned, Nandini, that you should not go out of the family to get support, that everything should be done either within yourself as a person or with your family. So I think that is probably a reason why this is not happening. But I think that, as you rightly said, it's not enough. The family is not able to, because the family is grappling with its own grief, and I think is not able to support enough. So maybe your book is going to make a difference. And maybe, like you said, each person handles grief in different ways. So possibly to give like an array of methods of connecting with each other, like Carla just mentioned, on Zoom. So some people may not want to come physically and be available, but would like to talk over the phone, or, to be on email or on a chat group, or on, so maybe trying to have, some people may just want information, just listening to you may make them feel better. So I think that probably trying to find ways in which different people might want to deal with their grief, maybe something that, one needs to explore. And this is probably the beginning. In a culture where one doesn't openly talk about one's emotions, particularly to a group of strangers, it's not something that we are, acculturated to do. So, and Nandini, there is a question for you.
Prabha, just a second. I just have a counter question. AA groups function in the country, right? How does that happen? That's it seems to be quite successful.
Yeah, I think AA groups have a different kind of methodology. There is there's a certain, first of all, that they want to work with their addiction. So there is a certain, desire. I think even AA groups, it was quite a challenge. It's not as popular as in the West. So the whole concept of support groups is a little bit of an issue here. But I think that for some conditions, it is important. It is increasing. And there are quite a few mental health support groups. So I think that maybe the culture is changing. And like I said, giving various options might be something, giving various windows for people to enter that space, in whatever way they are comfortable with, maybe. And like you rightly said, if it's so gendered sometimes, women are not able to, access support groups because they don't have the ability to do that. They don't have access to, methods by which they can do it. So maybe trying to kind of understand what is going on. But I think there are groups of people in the country, Nandini, want to do this. And maybe this is a platform that we should be focusing on. There is a question, there's several questions. One question to you, Nandini, is that, Carla's book seems to have had such a major influence on your healing. What are the other ways that you used to heal yourself?
I love this, Prabha. I read, well, bibliotherapy has always worked magic for me. I read every book on the subject. I think there's not a book I haven't read. I read every word on the internet on suicide and survivors of suicide loss. I read a lot of books on grief and grieving. The other things which helped me, this was the books part of it. The other thing which really helped me in my healing, I have a very loving family. My parents, my brother, my brother's wife, my mama is 98 years old, and the book is dedicated to my parents and my mama. And I have my nephew, my brother's, my sister-in-law, and this is my core family. And I have uncles and aunts who are also supportive. And I have friends who are actually family. I don't call them friends anymore. So I think I had amazing support both with from friends and family. And I also think it is my own inner resilience. I grew up in a very, very resilient family. I've had a very strong people who embodied resilience in thought, word, and deed. I actually heard of the word resilience very recently. I knew what resilience was, I think, right from the time I was growing up. So it just seemed, I saw it all happening, when challenges come, how do you face it? And in my own life, there have been multiple challenges. Of course, this takes the crown. So every challenge sort of, I keep telling Carla, I think we can face anything now. I don't know whether it's bravado or whether it's courage born out of this walk through fire. I can just handle anything. So when I find people getting so worried, I think, oh really? I mean, and the other things which also help me is my groundedness in spirituality. That's been happening even before this happened. So I think this very strong groundedness in spirituality, the sadhana, my everyday sadhana, which I do, I think my own rootedness in Vedanta, which I think is a huge factor. I've also been exploring traditional systems of healing, and I find that they are extremely helpful, especially acupuncture, Ayurveda, and there is this system of Siddha medicine called Marma massage, which works on the nerve centers in the body. It's incredible. So I find that all these traditional systems of healing, because I see grief as very embodied. It's in the body, it's not just in the head or in the mind. So I think all this has been helping me, and my own engagement with nature. I'm a wildlife photographer, and I love nothing better than escaping to the forest. So I think I find nature, engaging with nature, very healing. And I share space with two sacred companions, Malli and Minnal. I don't like to call them, refer to them as my dogs. Carla knows, Carla has Benji and Jansi. So they are also actually very healing. And I just feel that a strong sense of faith in the divine. No matter what happens, there is still so much of beauty around. And my own journey, that this victimhood, I think I was, they couldn't have been a better victim than me. So, this whole thing of getting out of victimhood, and I think it just prepared me to just really, stop getting into that victimhood narrative. So I don't know, probably I don't know whether this is I mean, I just felt what happened was I had no control over what happened, but where I had every control was how I choose to respond to this. It calls for a lot of self-awareness, self-reflection. It's not easy, and there are times when I loop and I slip and it's messy. But I think that's the journey, and I've just tried to be reflect that in Left Behind. Yeah, I
Thanks,
hope.
Nandini. I really liked your reference to embodiment and how the mind and body are connected, which we know as mental health professionals, when we do trauma work, we do a lot of work with the body because we recognize that it's not all there. It's
Exactly.
reflects, and your whole journey about using various other methods of treatment and healing is probably a very important aspect of your journey. There are quite a few mental health professionals
Oh,
on this
really?
listening to you,
Oh,
and they all want to learn from you and Carla. And some
wow.
of the questions are, how can we respond better? How can we do postvention better? What is it that you can teach us?
This is such an interesting question. Maybe I'll respond to it, and perhaps Kala should add to it. I'm not, I hope I don't come across as blaming or indicting the system. That's really not what I intend. I don't know. I just feel as mental health professionals, people like Carla and me with a lived experience of suicide loss, we would want a partnership with all of you. We would want you, as Prabha beautifully said, to listen to us. I think we can give you a wealth of insights which you may not find in your those textbooks, those tomes. I don't know how you guys read all that. Seriously, it's so heavy. But I think it's in stories that we find the essence of what it is to being a human. Um, I've had some very interesting experiences where I've had to encounter insensitivity among mental health professionals themselves. And I am not surprised because I work with the LGBT community and I'm an ally, and I know how many of my friends have had very negative experiences with a mental health system which looks at certain things which don't fit normative definitions as a disorder, and therefore stigmatized, and therefore the insensitivity. So what would I like from y'all? I would want a partnership. I would want us, we can help you develop modules for counselors and and psychologists, because I feel that's the usually the first interface where survivors of suicide loss meet. And I just feel when we come to you, we want you all to listen to our stories, not be just very eager to just give us a label and a diagnosis, prolonged grief disorder. I'm sorry, but this is how we feel. Ours is lifelong. Kala keeps telling me it's never going to disappear completely. Grief feels different every year. It feels different. I'm my fourth anniversary of the death is just 2 months away, and every year the anniversary feels very different. It's not like it's disappeared and it's all over. It's protein. So when we come to you for help, uh, 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 you know we would like our needs and concerns, very customized models of maybe psychotherapy, counseling, which is very, very suicide bereavement centric. And how do we would like you all to help us re-enfranchise the grief,
Mm.
uh, you know. Um and also just all those stages of grief, the acute grief and the prolonged grief. I think there's no timeline for us. Probably we need, probably maybe if it's acute grief is 3 months, for other so-called other kinds of bereavement, for us probably a timeline would be very different. um, and just don't be eager to just give us antidepressants, because that really is not what we are looking for. And this journey, we would want us to journey with us, and models of psychotherapy, models of counseling. In fact, I just found that during my journey, at times I just found I was my best therapist.
Mm.
Yeah, because I didn't find that sensitivity I was looking for. I didn't find the perspectives, not with everyone, but then I realized, okay, let me be my own best therapist. And of course, there are issues for which we need help. No matter how good a self-therapist you are, you sometimes need that someone with those perspectives, with that wisdom to guide you. And can we develop models of like, for instance, a very simple thing: what do you say and what not to say to survivors of suicide loss? I find most people have no clue about that. I've mentioned that in my book. Don't tell us, I understand how you feel. Unless you've had a similar experience of losing someone to suicide, you would never understand how we feel. Even in that, there are differences. So we would want very models of counseling, maybe very affirmative, very supportive. And how do we rebuild our lives, in the immediate aftermath of a suicide? Where is the postvention? And I think the whole family needs postvention, because everyone is confused. um, and then depending on the relationship to the deceased, like if it's a wife who's lost a husband to suicide, I think what is the kind of, and we need accompaniment, Prabha. It's not that we come to you, you tell us something, we, whatever it is, you give us a prescription and it's okay. No, I think we need accompaniment. This is a very long journey. uh, and we would like to be invited to your academia, to your fora, to talk, to your conferences. We don't have your academic degrees, but our experience is as valuable, and therefore can we work in partnership? uh, and we don't want to be top down. We don't want our experiences to be trivialized, minimized, glossed over. No, I don't know if that sounds like a tall order, but
No, thank you. Because, I always say that, we need mental health professionals need to be constantly learning from those who come to us for help. And because we don't know it all. And I think there are two things that I got from what you said just now. One is, of course, to be a partner in your journey, and to listen to you, to support you and nudge you a little bit wherever you need, but otherwise to kind of be there, just like a little buffer and a scaffold, to support you through the journey. And the second is to take your help in developing models of care,
yes.
because something that I might do from a very professional point of view may not actually be what is necessary, because these are theoretical models that I have, but you are the expert by experience. So to involve you in developing those models and testing them out,
Yeah.
and seeing what works for who, so those are my takeaways, and I hope the other mental health professionals who are listening will be able to use this.
Prabha, I have another suggestion. When we set up support groups, either online or offline, I feel it could be moderated by trained survivors, but it needs to be overseen by mental health professionals. That's where we would like your help, because sometimes in a support group, there could be someone who needs your help, your intervention. That's when we would, we wouldn't want to miss that.
Yeah, or talk to people about the support groups, tell
Yeah,
them there are support groups available and we think this is
exactly.
going to help you. So advocate for you,
Yeah.
be your advocate. Carla, you wanted to say
Yeah,
something?
I did want to add something. In addition to everything that's been said, I found it personally, and I have found it with other survivors of suicide loss, that many times when we go to a mental health professional, the focus is on the person we lost, and it's not on us, because it's very hard to compete with the drama of suicide. And it focuses on why do we think the person did it? Why do we, what? And so the focus is on the person who killed him or herself, and not on us, and not on our grief, and not on our feelings. And we're perfectly willing to talk about it, because at that point, that's all we're talking about. But when I found a therapist, when I came in and she said, "How are you doing?" And I was like, How am I doing? I mean, don't you want to know why Harry killed him? No, how are you doing? And it was all about me. It wasn't about him. It really saved me. I started going to her 3 times a week for the first couple of months, and then 2 times a week. And it was a place, my safe space, about how I was doing, about not why Harry had done it. And that focus on us as people grieving, and not on this very dramatic event that none of us, it's a mystery. Suicide is a mystery, and we're all wondering why somebody chooses to die and not to live. And it's hard to compete with those really existential questions. So finding a therapist who wants to know how we are doing, how we are feeling, is really helpful.
Thank you. Somebody's actually mentioned, Nandini, that, we probably need to go beyond modules and models to more frameworks to kind of give like a framework which will probably work for in many places and many situations. And I think that makes sense. There's been a lot of commendation for what, there's been a lot of praise in the chat about what you've gone through, and there has been quite a bit of sharing by others who've gone through similar experiences. There's, so some people have mentioned, Chandra has said, thank you for breaking the culture of silence. Being a psychologist, a mother, and losing my only son by suicide has been devastating, and that it requires a different response than the standard response to bereavement. Another person has talked about how she works at a university in another country where the death of a student by suicide was sort of hushed up, and people were not encouraged to talk about it, and the students were not encouraged to talk about it because it was said that that suicide does not deserve a funeral with dignity. And how that kind of completely, like you were talking about honor, Nandini, you mentioned how, and I wrote that down, that how the sense of honor is so important and the dignity is so important. And I think that's something that we need to be talking about from the rooftops. Yes, Nandini.
I also think, Prabha, uh, I think there needs to be multiple stakeholders in coming together to address suicide. And I think people with lived experiences are a very important stakeholder. Currently, we are not there anywhere in the discourse. It's like prevention, the mental health professionals take care of it. Where are we? At least in India, where are we? I would love us to be, actually, I think we are the best ambassadors for prevention, because we've lost it all, and therefore we say advocate for prevention. It really comes from a space deep within us. We are your best ambassadors for prevention, so do include us in the discourse. We can advocate, we can push, we can, people like Carla and me, of course, we have the ability to articulate, maybe engage with law enforcement. That's something I'm very, very keen to do. I understand they're doing their duty, but there is also a way to do it without already re-traumatizing the other person. I remember in Carla's book, she said when the police came there, they were so considerate. They offered her juice, and they sort of took care of her and did whatever they did. It was not as brutal as what I went through. Yeah.
You're so right, Nandini. There is a response from a mental health professional who says, I think it is inverting the pyramid from acknowledging that knowledge holders are those with lived experience.
Yes.
And we as therapists should try to take your learning to others around who need it.
Lovely.
So yeah, I think, I think it's so important when we acknowledge there are things that we don't know and that we need to learn. There are lots of, there's a lot of discussion about the legal system and the law around suicide, and how, it is stigmatized, and how lawmakers and judges need to have a relook on how they approach. So I think, again, it's very important. And I think, listening to you, even the police or lawmakers listening to the lived experience is, I think, going to be much more powerful than any amount of discussion that we are going to have, because we know that we've decriminalized suicide in India, but we still know that those investigations can happen. And like you said, maybe investigations need to happen, but they can be done in such a more dignified way, with a lot of respect for the person who died and for the person who's left behind. So I think that's so important.
And
There is-
also,
on
Prabha,
that,
yes,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to talk about our colleague, Dr. Frank Campbell of Baton Rouge. He started a postvention working with the coroner's office in Baton Rouge, where whenever there's a suicide, he has trained survivors of suicide loss going out with the police, with the coroners. So, and he tries to match up who they lost. So while it's being investigated, there is a survivor of suicide loss actually talking to the person or the family, say, wait a minute, I'm a survivor of suicide loss. I am here to talk with you. So there's already somebody to talk to immediately at that shocking time when we find the body or we learn about it. And it's been very successful, not only for the people who have lost somebody, but for those of us who are survivors of suicide loss, because it kind of gives meaning that we can help others with our grief. And it's a program that he's putting throughout the United States.
I think this is so fantastic, and it's you would think it's something intuitive, something that needs to actually happen, but we haven't really thought about it. So I think it's such a wonderful idea to do that, because it's only then that we will be able to, that when everybody else is doing all kinds of other stuff, here there's this one person who exactly understand what is needed at that point, and helps the person through it. So I think that's such a valuable input. And yeah, there are a few other questions which, let me see what. Yeah, there's something about a bereaved woman, and this is the gendered aspect to it, is still expected to perform care work and increase emotional labor for other bereaved family members. So while you're looking after yourself, you have to look after your family, your parents, his siblings, child, everything, which puts the woman's grief and mourning on the back burner and further complicates it. And they want to know your thoughts about it.
Oh, this is such a perceptive observation. Yeah, and I think it stems from the three C's, caring, cooking, and cleaning, uh, which is a woman's lot. And I also feel, I think it's a lovely point. I feel so much of caregiving is feminized. And I'm sure as a mental health professional, Prabha, caregiving in the mental health space is so feminized. It's excessively feminized. In fact, someday I want to write a book on that. It's like, it's almost like as if we were born to care, and is that the only thing we are supposed to be doing? Yeah, and I totally agree, even in grieving, because I went through that. Yeah, it's, I think we get into a do what needs to be done mode, and we do whatever needs to be done, and yet there's a part of us, huge part of us, which is grieving. Yeah, it's a lovely observation.
There's another response by another person who says, I'm a survivor. I lost my son in 2012. I do have a support group that I formed in 2014. It's a support group for moms, but sad to say that sometimes even moms don't understand the guilt. Yeah. So, do you want to sort of talk about, what happens when you start a support group and you feel that everybody's not in the same page as you, and people are probably in different parts of their journey, and how to sort of integrate that together,
Yeah, it's true, because I also feel a support group is also not a panacea, because it's so right that I also think, to understand this guilt and what is happening, one also, I don't know, I think it also calls for some degree of self-awareness, I feel, because it is extremely challenging, no doubt about it. But to understand what it's, and I find that in the early stages of grief, even if I tell people, uh, it doesn't matter, because, and I also think that that guilt is also part of that early stage of going through this. And then at some point you realize that, once you've gone all around in circles, it happened to me, this I called my gyan. It didn't come overnight. It was so agonizing, the messy middle. So when people tell me, oh, look at her, she's arrived, I just want to tell them, people, you have no idea what I'm going through. I'm still going through. Yeah. So
Nandini, thank you, Nandini, for that. And it's so interesting that as you're speaking, people are writing in chats which are just resonating with whatever both you and Carla are talking about. So
okay.
it's really interesting that it's almost like people's minds are all working in sync. And I always think that when people's minds are all working in sync, then there's great energy, and something will come out of
True, true.
out of this whole thing that has happened and the book. And we've overshot by 16 minutes.
Oh,
Yes, and we don't know how time has flown.
I know,
There's been so
seriously.
much energy in this virtual room that we've had. And I think, I really enjoyed reading about the pearl in the oyster and how that came about. And the cover of the book is so evocative, and that how the oyster actually forms the pearl, and how you know being impacted by suicide can turn into something which is a journey not just of healing but of discovering parts of yourself which you probably didn't know, and to be able to then give it out to other people. And that's what I think strikes me as a message for me as a mental health professional, is the generosity that both of you have had, you know the generosity of looking beyond yourself, which I think is not something that, I mean, I don't know. I don't think I do enough of that, of not just being in your hole, but to be able to actually spread the word, to talk to other people, to care for other people. So I think that generosity of spirit is something that I'm very grateful for today, that I've got from both of you. So thank you very much, and for being part of this. And I hope all of us will read the book, because it is an amazing book. I've read only the PDF part of it. I'm waiting to get my hands on the physical
I'm
book,
going
to
to.
touch and feel and smell and look at the book. And thank you so much, Carla and Nandini, for being part of this panel. I'm handing it over to Dr. Arjun.
Thank
Before
you.
Dr. Arjun takes over, I just want to tell you that I've always been mentored and championed by very strong women, and one of them is my mother. And today I found that both of you holding space for me, it just felt like such a strong Shakti blast, and more power and love to both of you. And I just can't tell you how much this means to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. And really, as we see after this pandemic, our world at the cusp of change. And really, I see a lot of change, very positive change also, because it's really deepening also our democracy, or as Nandini ma'am was saying, the union or the companion, what we have been. So as a society, both of our countries also, USA, India, both are also democracy. I really saw the lived experience by Nandini ma'am and Carla ma'am, what our chair also just suggested, that they are strengthening our union, strengthening humanity, and working for this cause. And chair also suggested that you both are our teachers for really, because as economists we all work for wealth of nations and whatnot, but this issue really is real wealth, the real well-being, also because our country, our part of country, and I'm so glad that South India, both our chair and speaker leading this from this our very land, but most part of our country also is so, there is different, and we have become so insensitive. There is farmer suicide, there is students are doing suicide, it all part of our life, or even at work. Prabha ma'am has worked a lot in during pregnancy, infant mortality, so many of things happening, or alcoholism, and there is so much of diversity also. When we talk about India, there is so different classes, there is no public programs for poor. So which groups do you tend to, or those who go through, there is so much of socio-economic things also. USA being a strong country and have all those system at place, we have so much of inequality, but really we also have old women pension and other things also for widows, significant number of household, single woman headed household. So many of things India is having. But thank you, Nandini ma'am, for pushing all these things, and our chair for really highlighting that the suicide prevention policy is coming, and we really have to have more evidences in medical science. As we know, in India it's also very costly also. So to have evidence of these sort of things, I would say we are enriching our knowledge, and also the awareness, advocacy at different levels and at different things, and adding consistent to enable us to understand more of this, and being able to really impart, I would say, make most out of the positive impact from this policy, or where we are moving forward. So let me just propose a vote of thanks of Prabha ma'am, or Nandini ma'am, or Carla ma'am. You would like to have 1 minute way forward, or any point, so you can have.
Just want to a big thank you to IMPRI for creating the space, Dr. Arjun. Means a lot to me.
Thank you, ma'am. Carla ma'am, would you like to have?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And like I said, my only regret is that I can't be there in person. Well, next year I'll be there in person, and we can, see each other's faces, touch each other, and just thank you so much for bringing this out to the open, and for inviting me. I'm very honored. And if any of you come to New York City, look me up, please.
We will. Thank you. Thank you. Prabha ma'am, over to you. And as India, as Professor Amar Singh says, argumentative Indian, and we are not talking about all these issues. Thank you so much for chairing this session. Ma'am, your concluding words.
Yes, I think that, if there is any takeaway from today's session, it is that, we need to have a way of looking at this whole situation in a very, very different way. As mental health professionals, we need to be very sensitive. We need to learn from other parts of the world which have already got systems in place, and try to use some of those very innovative methods of helping people who've been impacted by suicide, and making sure that mental health professionals have the sensitivity to handle this. I am today touched by the generosity of Carla and Nandini, and have learned so much. But I think what I should be doing now is to make sure that I advocate this as a mental health professional, as a champion for women's mental health, as a leader in the field. It's my duty to be able to talk about this much more, to make sure that this happens and doesn't just end with the webinar that we've done today. So hopefully, a year from now, we will actually see something happening on the ground, and be able to talk about this. To me, that would be the most important outcome of this book, and of your sharing of such invaluable narratives. So thank you very much.
Another book, another conference in person.
No,
Yeah.
no, Nandini
Collaboration.
No, Nandini ma'am is also joining us as a visiting faculty. So no, more impact, more policy. We'll look at these nuances to how to make also impact at the legal level, at the policy level, at different levels. And as you were advocating so much of, medical sciences, lived experience, police, law enforcement, economists, policy matters. So this has to, interact and work. We really don't have institution, US, other parts of the world have. So I think a lot of to do going forward. Books, of course, yes, but I think this fantastic. Prabha ma'am, Carla ma'am, please let us know if we can be of any help in this policy related matters, very technical. We try to have different stakeholders come in. The timing is really important, as we all know. in this, legislative and other works. So thank you so much. Let me just officially
Dr. Arjun,
propose
I
our
just have a small thing to say.
Please, please.
Prabha, there is, I think, this Mental Health Care Act has decriminalized suicide, but Section 309 has not yet been struck down. So I think people are looking for advocacy regarding that. So that is something. I have a friend who is a senior advocate in the Supreme Court, and she heard of the book. She said, this probably you can push that. And she
Yes.
was willing to support us. So maybe I think that's something where I think your expertise would also be hugely welcome. So maybe we should start talking about that as well. Yeah,
Yes, Nandini.
yeah, yeah.
Right. Right. It has been really long also. So once again, I thank all of you for joining here and discussing on this very pertinent issues on this special lecture and the book discussion on this topic, gender dimension and impact of suicide bereavement, exploring lived experiences, chaired by Prof. Prabha Chandra ma'am, and our speaker for today, Dr. Nandini Murli, and discussant Dr. Carla Fine ma'am. Thank you so much joining so early from USA. And ma'am's book has come out from WestLand publisher, and you can order it from the Amazon, Left Behind, Surviving Suicide Loss. And I wish you all a very nice evening, and thank you once again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, IMPRI, and thank you, Arjun.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.